Hello, everyone, and welcome to this tier list of Armenian kings. So this is not, of course, a ranking of every single Armenian monarch in history. That would be way too many kings for that. So I just picked a bunch of kings that actually have, either good artistic depictions or other depictions, and I'm going to go with that. And I hope you all enjoy this video. So the first king up here is King Pap. So this is actually a tough one right from the get-go. So King Pap, right? He was king. It's spelled P-A-P, right? So he was king in from 370 to 374 A.D. He was a king of the Armenian branch of the Arshakid dynasty, Arshakuni in Armenian. And his reign was quite tumultuous. So his father was, of course, Arshak II, who is also present, of course, here. And Arshak II was, of course, a famous king who struggled a lot with the Sassanids he fought several wars and battles with the Sassanids. And King Pap did as well. And Pap was actually supported by the Romans initially when he came to power. And so he had to struggle on both sides with Roman influence and constant Persian attacks. So, of course, his father had been killed by the Persians, the Sassanid Persians, and the war, one-on-one between Armenia and the Persian Empire was a very difficult one that Arshak was able to handle for a little while, but in the end there, of course, he was killed. Now, Pap was caught between a rock and a hard place because he also wanted to avoid Roman influence as well. And the other issue he had was, of course, he was not exactly a devout member of the Armenian Apostolic Church. He was more sort of an Arian king, an Arian Christian king, which brought him into severe conflict with the Catholicos at the time, Husik. And actually this culminated in Husik being killed. Okay, so King Pap killed the Catholicos, and this, of course, caused serious problems with the nobility, and it caused problems with essentially everybody. And Pap was eventually killed. Now, Pap, he fought battles with the Romans, he fought with the Persians, and, he was, for his short reign, able to keep his sovereignty. However, this was not long-lasting. He was unable to sort of make this stick and make it last, and that's because his domestic policy was too divisive. So he's definitely not the worst Armenian king in history. He did fight, right? But he was not great. His domestic policy really backfired on him. However, you could say if the nobility, if the church, if they rallied around him, that perhaps things could have been different. This is a tough case. This is a tough case indeed. So I'm going to put King Pap, because of his military achievements, his successes. He did have some successes. I'm going to put him as a C, because you can't ignore the fact that he was not able to keep the country united, and this is essentially what doomed the Arsakid Kingdom of Armenia. Okay, so next we have Ashot I. Ashot I was, of course, the founder of the Bagratuni dynasty, the Armenian Bagratid dynasty. The kingdom of Armenia under the Bagratid dynasty. He was able to essentially resurrect the kingdom of Armenia in the medieval period in the 9th century, following several centuries of foreign rule, essentially. So Armenia, after the Arsakid kingdom collapsed in 428. Armenia was governorship. There was a Roman governorship in Armenia, a Persian governorship, the Marzbanate, and then, of course, the Byzantines. There was Byzantine Armenia, and then, of course, there was the Emirate of Armenia that was under the control of the Caliphate. Right, though there were, of course, several native Armenian rulers at that time, and they sort of dominated the local political landscape. Armenia did not have a king of its own, right? And Ashot, uh, during the mid 9th century, he was step by step was able to take important strides towards restoring Armenia's sovereignty over itself, until eventually he was able to essentially force his neighbors, the Caliph and the Byzantine Emperor, to send him crowns and acknowledge him as king of Armenia. And he essentially resurrected the kingdom of Armenia, which had been defunct for over 4 centuries, right? So 885 is when Ashot was crowned king of Armenia. So Ashot is definitely one of the greatest Armenian kings to ever live, because if he had not done everything he could to resurrect Armenia's sovereignty over itself, there would be no medieval kingdom of Armenia, and that probably means there would have been no Armenian kingdom of Kilikia, and none of that cultural renaissance that occurred during the Bagratid period. So Ashot is definitely, someone who saved Armenia. Without him, who knows if the kingdom of Armenia would have ever been resurrected, or if Armenia would even exist today. So Ashot is an S-tier king. He reigned only 5 years, 885 to 890, but it was what he did before he was crowned king that it makes him so important. And of course, when he was king, his reign was quite fine for the short period of his reign. Next, we have King Trdat III. So, or Tiridates III. Now, he was, again, another king of the Arshakuni dynasty, the Arsakid dynasty of Armenia, which reigned from the 1st century AD all the way to the 5th century, 428 AD, when the last king was delivered by the Armenian nobles to the Persian king. And they said they didn't want the Arsakid dynasty to rule anymore as kings. And Tiridates, of course, ruled in the early part of the 4th century AD, and he is, of course, famous because it was during his reign that Armenia converted to Christianity and chose Christianity as the state religion and founded the Armenian Apostolic Church and everything during his time. Now, Trdat III, of course, his domestic policy was marked in the early period by persecution of Christians, a growing Christian minority in Armenia. Of course, there was not a majority Christians in Armenia at the time. Armenia was a pagan country. And Trdat, eventually, when he did convert to Christianity, he embarked on a serious campaign of erasure. So the only really pagan temple you can find in Armenia from, the pre-Christian period is Garni, which was preserved. It was also a sort of royal bath complex. Perhaps that's why the Garni temple was also preserved. I'm not, of course, 100% sure exactly why they only preserved that one. But, so there was a lot of erasure that occurred during his reign, and a serious shift in, the Armenian government's policy regarding religion. So this, of course, didn't mean that the Armenian pagans were wiped out during his reign. Of course, there were still plenty of them. There were still plenty of nobles who were pagan, who did not really follow the king's guidance. And, this was something that the kings struggled with, like King Pap struggled with for the rest of the 4th century into the 5th century. And then past the 5th century, or in the middle of the 5th century, when Armenia was not independent and was Marsbanate in the Sassanid Empire. Of course, there was the Armenian-Persian War, which pitted the Christian Armenian nobles against the Zoroastrian Sassanids, as well as several local Armenian notables who had sided with the Persians. And there were perhaps even more of them than nobles who had not sided with the Persians, right? Who had sided with the rebellion. Now, so Trdat himself was a pretty strong king. He was able to hold off the Persians very well. In terms of his foreign policy, he was very very much pro-Roman. I have to say, he was a strong king, and his legacy is felt even today. And while he was not able to solve all of the kingdom's problems, and, a lot of the problems that remained near the end of his reign were issues that plagued Armenia for quite a while afterwards, I have to give him a B, because he was not able to sort of consolidate what he had done. And that's why, we have a period of instability after his reign, like with King Pap. So I have to put him right in the middle. A strong king. His legacy is both positive and negative. I have to give him a B. I'm sure I'll be attacked in the comments for my ranking of Tiridates III from both perspectives, but I have to put him in the middle. Okay. So the next king here is not actually a king, it's Roupen, the first prince of Armenian Kilikia. He is, of course, the prince who declared independence in the 11th century in 1080 AD. Following the destruction of the Bagratid kingdom of Armenia, several Armenian nobles and the Armenian Bagratid royal family, they were moved into areas of Cappadocia. And that included, of course, Gagik II, the last king of Ani, who had been deposed, essentially, when Ani was annexed to the Byzantine Empire. And Roupen was one of these nobles who had gone with the king to Cappadocia. Of course, I believe Gagik II was given Lycandus to rule as a governorship, and Lycandus was north of Kilikia. And upon the assassination of Gagik II in the 1070s, different manuscripts give different dates for that assassination, assassinated by Byzantines, Roupen, along with his son Constantine I, there was some debate over was Roupen actually alive at this time or not, but in any case, Roupen, along with his son Constantine I, went to Kilikia and took over some fortresses in the mountains and essentially created Armenian Kilikia. Now, Roupen thus essentially became responsible for, again, another rebirth of Armenian statehood, and essentially, while he personally was not able to resurrect the kingdom of Armenia, it was his actions that laid the foundation, laid the groundwork for restoring the kingdom of Armenia eventually in, of course, not Armenia, but Kilikia. Now, Roupen was militarily successful. He took advantage of a serious power vacuum after the Battle of Manzikert, and he was able to essentially fortify areas that were impregnable for the Seljuk Turkish invaders, who did not really venture into those mountainous regions. And when they did, Roupen and his successors were able to hold them off using their extensive network of fortifications, fortresses like Vahka, Parzerpert, and several others. And Roupen thus had an incredible legacy, of course. Eventually, in 1199 AD, his another member of his dynasty, Levon I, or Levon II Prince, and Levon I King, was crowned king of Armenia, of Armenian Kilikia. So, Roupen, the only thing is we don't know that much about him, and the other thing is, while he laid the foundations for the rebirth of the kingdom of Armenia, he was not able to accomplish that personally, of course. So I have to give him an A. I can't give him an S because, first of all, there are a lot of hazy details in his biography, and we're not entirely sure exactly the territory he controlled, military conflicts he had, but, based, of course, on circumstantial evidence, we can say that he was a very effective leader, and, of course, his impact was felt for centuries later. And even today, of course, we still have the Church of Kilikia, the Kilikian Catholicosate of the Armenian Church. Okay, and the next king we have is Levon IV. Levon IV is perhaps one of the worst leaders Armenia has ever had in its history. Levon IV, though he has perhaps the best depiction on a manuscript. This is a very beautiful manuscript by Sarkis Pitzag from the 14th century, Kilikia. And Levon IV reigned from approximately 1320 to 1341. Now, Levon IV, he was of the Hetumian dynasty, the dynasty of Hetum, which followed the dynasty of Roupen. And so he was an Armenian monarch of Armenian descent. And he was strongly pro-Western. So he, of course, ascended the throne in a very difficult period. So he was actually underage at the time he ascended the throne. So his father was King Oshin of Armenian Kilikia. And Levon IV kind of inherited the problems that his father had. Now, Levon IV, again, when he ascended the throne, he was underage. So there was a regent called Oshin of Korikos. Korikos, of course, a fortress in southwestern Kilikia. You can still see its fortress today. It was a nice port, quite a profitable port for the kingdom. It was perhaps the second most important port for the kingdom of Armenian Kilikia after Ayas, Layatso, Italian. Now Levon, when he actually became of age to rule, he ordered Oshin of Korikos and all his other family members killed. Now, Oshin of Korikos was a difficult figure because he, of course, had probably, allegedly, assassinated King Oshin because of King Oshin's sort of pro-Western, pro-Catholic policies. So Oshin was in favor of uniting the Armenian and Catholic churches, and he, of course, took many steps to make that a reality, which, of course, angered the church, and it angered, of course, a lot of barons in the kingdom. And Levon IV and Oshin of Korikos perhaps poisoned Oshin because of that, and Oshin of Korikos seems to have been a sort of the more national wing of the barons of the kingdom of Armenian Kilikia. Now, Levon IV, of course, perhaps resented this. Well, without a perhaps, because he had them all killed, all the Korikos family, as well as his other family members, his cousins. So Levon started out his reign doing that, and then, of course, immediately after that, you have Mamluk attacks, and Levon is forced to pay an extreme indemnity to the Mamluks. And Levon at that point, and this is in the late 1320s and early 1330s. Now, at that point, serious losses had been incurred on the eastern frontier of the kingdom right at the start of Levon IV's reign, because the Mamluks attacked very quickly after he sort of ascended the throne and came of age. So he started his reign at a very difficult time. Now, but the problem was he was unable to rectify any of these issues. So we have another king, I believe on this list, yes, Levon II, the son of Hetum. And Levon II was able to sort of inherit a pretty similar situation as Levon IV, but he was able to rectify it through strong actions, through uniting the country, through building a strong base within the nobility. Levon IV was unable to do this. He constantly antagonized everyone in the nobility. He was not able... So his father, Oshin, had antagonized... even though he was pro-Western, pro-Catholic, he had, at the same time, antagonized them. So they were not... So the Knights Hospitaller were unwilling to provide a lot of support to the Kingdom of Armenian Kilikia because Oshin had actually confiscated the many Hospitaller estates, or actually pretty much mostly all of them. in the kingdom of Kilikia and Armenia, and that had really antagonized them. And of course, the Hospitallers lobbied against Oshin and his son, Levon IV, because of this. And Levon IV was sort of slow in rectifying that. And so even though he sort of has this pro-Western policy and constantly writes to the Pope for support against the Mamluks of Egypt, he was unable to sort of win everyone over. And, he was unable to... of course, he created that image to the Mamluks that he was a dangerous enemy because, of course, if he did get the Western support he wanted, then the Mamluks foresaw perhaps another crusade, right? Even though that probably was not going to happen, Levon did not help the situation by antagonizing all of his possible allies. And then, of course, Levon IV, it was during his reign, 1337, when Ayas was lost. And, of course, without Ayas, the kingdom of Armenian Kilikia lost its economic lifeline, its most important port city, which was actually more important than perhaps Alexandria and Limassol in Cyprus, more important than Famagusta. So without that port, the kingdom of Armenian Kilikia's days were numbered, and Levon IV was unable to mount an effective resistance. Even though the kingdom was still intact at the end of his reign, he had lost Seleucia in the west. He had lost Antiochia in Trachea in the west, Antiocheta. He had lost a lot of territory in the west and east, and really a period of serious contraction, serious disunity, and none of his apparently pro-Western policies worked because he had also antagonized the West and was unable to rectify the issues, right? So Levon IV essentially started didn't start the downfall, but really extremely accelerated the downfall of the kingdom of Armenia for good. It never recovered from that. So Levon gets a D. If there was an F here, I would give him an F. The absolute worst of the worst. And next we have Oshin. Oshin is an interesting figure. He reigned from about 1307 to 1320. So, in 1307, the previous king, Hetum II, as well as his brothers, Toros III, Levon III, were murdered by a Mongol general. So the Mongols, the Ilkhanate Mongols, were allies of the Armenian kingdom of Kilikia, and they went on several campaigns together against the Mamluks with most mixed success. So Armenian Kilikia was actually able to gain territories in this time, but it also gained a serious enemy in the Mamluks, and they were unable to sort of rectify, or I don't know why I keep saying rectify. Oshin had to sort of balance this alliance with the Mongols and with this antagonistic relationship with the Mamluks, of course, and relationships with the West as well, which were very important, especially for trade and the economy of the kingdom. And the Mongols, had been responsible for the murder of the previous kings, right? So Oshin had to immediately drive a Mongol army out of the kingdom, and he went to the Ilkhanate and, said that this Mongol general should be executed for what he had done, and that's, of course, what happened. So Oshin was actually able to sort of solidify the kingdom of Armenia after a serious period of instability, which reigned during King Hetum II's reign, his brother. So Oshin is sort of, at the very beginning, a positive political figure. So Oshin's reign actually starts out pretty well. He's able to sort of stabilize the kingdom after the seriously unstable reign of his predecessors. And actually, he's able to sort of stabilize the frontier on all sides as well, militarily. Now, we don't have many sources about Oshin's military exploits, but it's clear that several fortresses were reconstructed. The walls and the fortifications at Tarsus, especially, were reconstructed. There were several major construction projects, especially in Tarsus, the city of Tarsus, as well as in other areas. And we know that he recovered several lost regions because, under Levon IV talks about ceding territories to the Knights Hospitaller so that they could defend territories that Levon was unable to defend, that are territories that were lost in the late 13th century during the Mamluk invasions of that period. So clearly during Oshin's reign, he was able to take back some lost regions in the east and west and north of the kingdom, which is remarkable considering, like I mentioned when we were talking about Levon, he antagonized actually the Knights Hospitaller, who were some of the most important allies for the Armenian kingdom of Kilikia. He actually confiscated some of their estates, and this probably had to do with taxation because the Hospitallers would not pay taxes on their estates, but they would sort of facilitate trade, right? They would defend convoys, things of that nature. But antagonizing them turned out to be a big issue because, if they wanted to go for a big pro-Western policy, antagonizing the military orders was not the way to go about doing that. And on the other hand, he was good with the Mongols, right? So the Mongol support never wavered during his reign, and the Mongols supported him against the rogue Mongol general who had assassinated the previous kings. So Oshin had a pretty interesting reign. However, he was strongly pro-Western, much like his predecessors, especially Hetum II, and he definitely favored a union of the Armenian and Catholic churches, which would, he thought, facilitate more Western support for the kingdom to defend the kingdom. Because, of course, at this point, the kingdom had enemies on all sides. The Karamanids in the west and north, the Mamluks in the south and east. Right, so these were huge issues for the kingdom. And, of course, there were also Turkoman tribes that were being resettled by the Mamluks in order to cause havoc in the kingdom. So, Oshin, despite his political missteps, especially in his foreign policy with the Hospitallers, and antagonizing even the nobles, right? Because eventually he was poisoned, most probably, by Oshin of Korikos. He was able to keep the kingdom intact, expand the kingdom, refortify many destroyed fortifications, strengthen the kingdom's position militarily. But, there's a visit that occurs during his reign. He visits Armenia. He's the last Armenian king to actually visit Armenia proper, which had, of course, been done by previous kings like Hetum I. But when Oshin goes to Armenia, he doesn't do anything to increase his sort of political standing there as king of all the Armenians, because, of course, from Hetum I, the Armenian kings of Kilikia start calling themselves kings of all the Armenians, and this gives them more political clout, right? Because they are apparently kings of all the Armenians in Greater Armenia as well as the Armenians under their jurisdiction directly. However, when Oshin goes to Armenia, he calls a conference regarding, mixing water with the wine during the service, during a church service. Now, and then, if I'm not mistaken, this conference is not successful. Very few show up. And this was, of course, one of his efforts to gain Western support, right, by changing minutiae of church doctrine. So Oshin was, in that regard, definitely misguided, right, if he thought that was going to change much. So Oshin is a difficult king to rank because he antagonized people he should not have. He was able to keep alliances he should have. He avoided all-out conflict with the Mamluks. He refortified the country, which, again, made it stable enough to survive several decades following his death. So I have to give him a solid B, because while he has some very bad points, he has some good points as well. Oshin, very tough one to rank here, right? Okay. Now we have Ashot III, right? So during Ashot III's reign, he reigned in the latter part of the 10th century. He was a king of the Bagratid dynasty of Armenia. And Ashot III was a pretty strong king. He was able to expand his domains, increase royal authority. However, during his reign, that's when the Bagratid kingdom begins to fragment. You start to see several sub-kingdoms within Armenia, such as the Kingdom of Lori, the Kingdom of Parissos, the Kingdom of Gardman, several sub-kingdoms. And of course, it's these sub-kingdoms and their internal divisions that cause the downfall of Bagratid Armenia, of the medieval kingdom of Armenia in Greater Armenia, which eventually collapsed in 1045. So, the kingdom doesn't even last 100 years following his death, despite the fact that during his reign, everything was quite stable, quite peaceful, and the kingdom was quite strong. But this division that began during his reign was a serious issue. He is also the one who transferred the capital to Ani, if I'm not mistaken, and constructed many of its fortifications. And so that occurred during his reign. Serious architectural, cultural renaissance during his reign, and military success as well. Again, very mixed legacy for Ashot III. So for him, I have to give him... this is a tough one. I have to give him a B, because really a political legacy, very poor political legacy in my opinion, but a very great cultural, architectural legacy. And during his reign, things were quite good. So Ashot III gets a B. So then we have Levon I. Levon I was prince of Armenian Kilikia in the early part of the 12th century. I believe he was prince from 1129 to 1137, following the death of his brother Toros I. Now, during Toros I's reign, Armenian Kilikia was able to gain a lot of territory, including Sis Anazarbus, which became the capital in this period. And, of course, Anazarbus's fortifications, a lot of them constructed during Toros and Levon's reign, are some of the largest medieval fortifications you'll find in the entire Middle East. So, Levon I was actually able to expand. He took the coast of Kilikia under his control. It became under Armenian control for the first time ever. And he was able to expand his domains seriously against the Byzantines and against Seljuk invasions. Now, the problem is that in 1137, his successes, he began to besiege Seleucia, which was a Byzantine possession, an important Byzantine city in western Kilikia, and actually the capital of its own theme, its own province. Now, this siege sort of incurred the wrath of the Byzantine Emperor John II Comnenus, who defeated Levon I, captured many of the fortifications of Armenian Kilikia, and essentially ended Armenian independence in Kilikia for a number of years, about a decade. We're not sure. So Levon I, quite ambitious, but perhaps you could say not very tactful, antagonized a lot of would-be allies, even the Crusaders. He antagonized them as well. He fought with them over control of southern Kilikia. He was actually able to win in those battles, but his antagonism, when he antagonized the Byzantines too much, that caused serious problems. I have to give him a C. He was a little too ambitious for his own good. Next, we have Levon I, king, Levon II, prince of Armenian Kilikia. So he reigned as prince in the late 12th century, and then he was crowned king in about 1199 or 1198 AD. He was crowned king of Armenia, Kingdom of Armenian Cilicia. So he was able to reestablish the Kingdom of Armenia, which had been destroyed again in 1045 when the Bagratid kingdom fell. So Levon, of course, that's a pretty strong resume by itself, but how was he able to accomplish this? So he came to power in a difficult period. So Armenian Cilicia was, again, between a rock and a hard place. You had the Crusaders in the south who were both friendly and unfriendly. Of course, the Principality of Antioch claimed a lot of those cities in southern Cilicia and fortresses. And Levon did fight with them about that. There was, of course, the War of Antiochian Secession during his reign, which weakened the Principality of Antioch severely. But eventually, of course, Antioch did accept the sort of suzerainty of Armenian Cilicia eventually during the reign of Hetum I. But, of course, it was weakened so much that it became essentially a non-player in the politics of the Near East. And this was a problem because, of course, the Mamluks just came rushing through the weakened Principality of Antioch, right? And that caused serious problems in 1266 during the reign of Hetum. So Levon had you could say, a divisive policy in the east and south, but he was able to expand his territory. So Levon I, essentially in the early part of the 13th century, which is when he reigned as king, that is when he made some really good moves. So, like I mentioned before, his war against the Templars and the Principality of Antioch was kind of a hit and miss, right, for the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, because while it did increase their influence over Antioch, right, it also kind of weakened Antioch as a buffer between them and then eventually, of course, the Mamluk Sultanate. So that was a hit and miss sort of war there. But on the other frontiers in the east, for example, in the center of the kingdom and in the east, Levon was able to strengthen the border by gifting land to the Teutonic Knights. So the Teutonic Knights actually had quite a few fortresses right in the center there, including a very important fortress called Amuda, of which very little is left. It was essentially destroyed in 1266 by the Mamluks. But the Teutonic presence there was essential for ensuring stability and trade route stability as well. So it was a very smart move. And it also made the Holy Roman Emperor a very good ally of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, because, of course, the Teutonic Knights were favorites of the Holy Roman Emperor. And that alliance was very important for Levon I, because, of course, that was kind of what secured him his crown eventually. Now, in the west and in the north, Levon actually conquered quite a bit of territory. He conquered west, all the way to the west of Kalonoros, or modern Alanya, and in Pamphylia. So he essentially conquered quite a bit of Pamphylia, which is the country to the west of Cilicia. And he also conquered Heraclea and Lorende, which are to the north of Cilicia, right? And he also conquered some districts of Cappadocia, to the north of the mountains, the Taurus Mountains. So he actually had some grand military adventures there. Additionally, what he did is he knew that with his forces, he would not be able to hold those territories. So what he did was he granted places like Heraclea, places like Anemurion, to the Hospitaller Knights. So the Hospitaller Knights, and Seleucia as well, the castle of Seleucia. So the Hospitaller Knights would actually hold these areas like Antiocheta, Anemurion, Heraclea, these areas that were difficult to control for the Armenian army, and they would act as a sort of buffer territory, right? So that would be an extremely important thing, as I will mention, So essentially, in the later part of his reign, or actually after his death, you have issues where there are invasions from all sides. There's an invasion from the west, a very strong Seljuk invasion, a very large army, and they take Anamurian, and they take Heraclea, and the western frontier is gone. And then you have the Hospitaller Knights at Seleucia Castle. And this is sort of an interregnum, or a difficult period for the kingdom, following the death of Levon, because of course his daughter Isabella, who was also underage, became queen, right? But she was underage, and there were regents, and she was going to be married to a sort of European, essentially, and people didn't like this, so there were a lot of problems. But the combined defense of the garrison at Seleucia and the Hospitaller Castle next to Seleucia City, Seleucia Trachea, in western Kilikia, that was able to hold off the Seljuk army, the Seljuk attack. So that was quite, great foresight on Levon I's part. If he did not create that sort of buffer territory, then the kingdom probably would have lost a lot more than it did in that Seljuk attack, right? So Levon, he had incredible foresight. He was able to cultivate incredible relationships with both the West and Egypt as well. He had very good relations with Saladin of Egypt, and he was able to sort of sway everyone to his side, except for the Seljuks, who were his constant enemies. And of course, and the Principality of Antioch, which was also his enemy, and the Knights Templar. But other than them, he was able to really create an incredible political balance in Armenian Kilikia, and that's how he was able to get his crown, elevate their realm to the status of kingdom. And he had a really remarkable reign, and he deserves to be in an S tier, in the S tier up here with Ashot Bagratuni. Okay, next we have another king of Kilikia. Actually, let's kind of mix it up here because a lot of these guys are Kilikian kings. So let's go for Vramshapuh, who's the one on the left here. So Vramshapuh was another Arsakid king of the Arshakuni dynasty, Arsakid dynasty of Armenia. And he reigned in a very difficult period. So he reigned near the turn of the 5th century AD. And he reigned after the partition of Armenia between the Roman realm and the Sassanid realm, right? So a bunch of territory was essentially taken from the Arsakid kingdom, and that was under Roman control. And Vramshapuh was king of whatever was left of Armenia that was under that was essentially a Sassanid vassal at the turn of the 5th century. And Vramshapuh had very little in the way of means to resist the Romans or Sassanids militarily. The military had, of course, been weakened by the constant wars in the 4th century, and, of course, the political divisions within the country in the latter part of the 4th century had caused serious problems. So there you have Vramshapuh. And militarily, we don't know much about his exploits. We can assume, like most kings, he did some campaigning, but we don't have any data about that. However, Vramshapuh was, of course, the king responsible for being the patron of the invention of the Armenian alphabet by Mesrop Mashtots and, of course, the Catholicos at the time, Sahak Bartev, Sahak the Parthian. Now, Vramshapuh, by doing this, really, his impact on the future of Armenia can be felt to this day, because Armenia still utilizes that same alphabet that was created during the time of Vramshapuh. Vramshapuh's priorities. He knew how to exercise soft power, while previous kings of the Arsakid dynasty of Armenia had tried to utilize hard power, right? They had tried to fight the Sassanids and Romans head on, like King Pap, especially, or King Arshak II, as we'll talk about later, and King Tiridates as well, though Tiridates used soft and hard power. It depends. Vramshapuh only had soft power to work with, or at least he chose that route, and he did it magnificently with the invention of the alphabet, which of course caused essentially the formation of Armenian culture as we know it, Armenian literary culture. And of course, what sprang from that was the amazing translation of the Bible into classical Armenian, as well as the amazing Armenian historical works. And of course, like Moses Chorenatsi, Moses of Choren, Agathangelos, several others, of course, and these works are of extreme importance to the history of the Near East and world history, indeed, because, of course, the Sassanid Empire did not have a sort of tradition of historical writing. A lot of other Near Eastern peoples did not have that tradition of historical writing. It goes back to the Sumerian period. That's an issue there, too. We don't have historical writing, right, from those periods, those peoples. But, of course, Armenian literary culture, being heavily influenced by Hellenistic literary culture, had been exposed heavily to this historical genre, right? So Vramshapuh's patronage of this invention of the Armenian alphabet so important, and he was able to keep the throne and keep the kingdom at least semi-independent as a vassal for quite a good while. I believe he died in 414 AD, and the kingdom lasted another 14 years after his death. Unfortunately, there were less gifted kings after him. And as far as we know, he was very good with the nobility. He kept a good balance with the Romans and Sassanids and the local nobility and the church, very good relations with the church. So he's an S-king. He had an extremely difficult situation. He couldn't do much, really, politically. But what he was able to do has had an impact on the Armenian people and Armenian history up to the present day. And for that, we should all thank Vramshapuh. He is an S-tier king. And even though we don't know too much about him personally, his mastery of utilizing soft power is something I think we can learn from today as well. So next we have Levon II, king of Armenian Kilikia. He was the successor to his father, Hetum I, one of the most famous Armenian kings in history. And Levon II inherited a very difficult situation. Of course, as we know, at the end of Hetum's reign, there was a great battle at a place called Mari. And this event was called the Disaster of Mari because the Mamluk army came up on the Armenian army very quickly. They were not able to prepare very well, and the army was in no shape to be challenging the entire Mamluk army of the Mamluk Sultanate. And the princes, Toros and Levon, so Levon II were actually Toros was killed, Levon was captured by the Mamluks. Hetum had to pay an extremely large indemnity to the Mamluks. The Mamluks raided the kingdom very badly. So actually, the kingdom lost a ton of wealth in those raids in 1266. Important fortresses like Amuda, the Teutonic fortresses, were destroyed and never rebuilt, never recovered. However, Levon inherited this really horrible situation because the kingdom had been doing so well under Hetum. The kingdom had really been doing well. And, of course, Hetum had forged that alliance with the Mongols, the Ilkhanate eventually. And using his shrewd diplomacy and his good relations with both the West and the Mongols, he had really been able to make the kingdom prosper under his rule. And all of that was essentially lost. I don't want to say all of it, but quite a lot of it. So Levon inherited this very tough situation. Now, he's an example of a really excellent monarch because he took this difficult situation and he was able to, again, he essentially tried to reestablish what his father had created. He utilized every connection his father had made to bring the kingdom back from the brink, right? So, and he challenged the Mamluks. He did not give up. He went against them again and again, right? And Levon actually was able to retake territories quite a lot against the Mamluks, especially in that border frontier near the Amanus Mountains. He was able to reconstruct several destroyed fortresses. And he did it all, I don't want to say all by himself, but he was able to at least leverage as much military might as he had. He was able to leverage his connections with the Mongols and the West to reestablish Armenian Kilikian economy. And, you know, he's an example of a leader who just did not give up, even in the face of Mamluk military superiority, population superiority, economic superiority. Levon didn't give up. He constantly fought back. He constantly tried to retake territories that his father had lost near the end of his reign. And Levon really, he could have, if he was a poor monarch, then the kingdom, I think, probably would have collapsed during his reign. But he brought it back, and because of his excellent rule, because of his persistence, and he reigned from about about 1270 to 1289, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head, at the end of the 13th century. If he had not been able to really bring the kingdom back from the brink, then the kingdom would not have lasted all the way up to 1375, about 100 years after him. So, really an excellent monarch. Now, was he able to save the kingdom, let's say? Was he able to... well, you know, you have to look at the history of his children, like Hetum II and Oshin as well. And you see they start to have issues because they are very pro-Catholic Church, right? And this causes internal disputes, right, within the kingdom. And those internal disputes tear the kingdom apart, right? And this is after the death of Levon II. Now, Levon II, he had many children, and I think, you know, something he could have done is made sure that they handled these church affairs better than they did. So Levon II, excellent king overall, could have done a little better helping his kids figure out foreign policy, domestic policy. So I give him an A. Next, we have, let's leave the Kilikian kings for now. Let's go back to here. Artashes, I put him twice. Well, why not? Because he's the first king here on this list, if I'm not mistaken, from the Artaxiad dynasty, the Artashesian dynasty, which reigned from the early 2nd century, about 190 or 189 BC, all the way to the early 1st century AD. And this is perhaps the most famous dynasty, I'd like to say, if you're interested in the Roman period, because even though the Arsacids had a longer reign from the 1st century to the 5th century, the Artashesians, or the Artaxiads, they really laid the foundation for what Armenia was going to be, for the kingdom of Armenia, right? Because there was, of course, a dynasty before the Artaxiads, the Orontid dynasty, and actually Artashes, or Artaxias himself, claimed to be from this dynasty, and I'd like to think he was. They are really the ones who created the kingdom of Armenia, the one we know with the borders that we all know as Greater Armenia, right? That's a sort of thing that emerged in the Artaxiad period. Now, Artashes I was the first king of this dynasty. Of course, like I said, he called himself an Orontid or Yervanduni, but he was a different sort of king. So the Yervanduni, the Orontids, were definitely Achaemenid successors, right? They were in Achaemenid successor state, and I don't have any Orontid kings on this list because we just don't know enough about the Orontid dynasty kings to say much, right? All of our sources come from foreign sources. We don't have any. We have very few texts from them. And thus, it's very difficult to put them in a ranking like this, especially with so many kings that we have so much data from, right? So, Artashes was definitely one of the greatest kings in Armenian history. And why is that? He is remembered extremely fondly in Armenian historiography. And of course, he is, remembered in Greek historiography as well. Strabo talks about him. And he was able to essentially, in the Orontid period, the kingdom was, like I said, it was very tribal. It was sort of a tribal kingdom. It wasn't exactly united. It was very much a local power. That's how they kind of played politics. They played things out as more of a local power. Now they did. That's not to say they never conquered anything, because we know they did. Because we end up having Orontid kings in regions like Comagene and Sopene that were apparently Seleucid, but then they have Orontid kings. So it seems like the Orontids expanded into those territories. It's just that none of that is covered in the histories, right? So we only know things circumstantially. But Artashes, we know, was able to bring the kingdom back from a sort of a difficult period at the end of the Orontid dynasty. Of course, the Seleucids had been warring with the Orontids, and the Orontids were getting the worst of it. And Artashes was actually able to seize power. Of course, the histories are not exactly clear, but Artashes seems to have overthrown that last Orontid king, Orontes IV, Yervand IV, in about 200, approximately 200. And he established the Artaxiad dynasty, and he created a new capital called Artaxata, or Artashat. And this would become one of the most famous cities, of course, at the time. A very nice capital to replace the old capital of Yervantashat, which replaced Armavir, the traditional Orontid capital. Now, Artaxias is remembered fondly not only because of his military exploits. Of course, he was able to unite and expand the kingdom, especially in the east, right? He was able to take quite a bit of territory in the east and south that had not been under Orontid control, apparently. But he also was able to cultivate the land. This was something that was very important, especially for the Armenian historians. Is they credit Artashes with cultivating the land, right? Working the land. So if the land is not cultivated, if it's not worked, then the kingdom, doesn't have firm roots, firm foundations. And this is something that Artashes was able to do, and this is something he is remembered for very fondly. And this is something that he really took the kingdom of Armenia from being just another Achaemenid successor kingdom, tribal sort of kingdom, and he brought it up to the status of a regional power. And then, of course, later kings would bring it up to the status of a imperial power for a while. An expansive power. And without Artashes's foundations there, that would not have been possible. So Artashes I is definitely an S-tier king. And I highly encourage Armenians who would like to be leaders to read Moses Khorenatsi's passages about him, because they are very interesting indeed. So next, we have Arshak II. Now, Arshak II was a controversial king. Of course, he is known in the histories as being quite hairy. Now, he was a king of the Arsakid dynasty of Armenia, and he reigned in the latter half of the 4th century AD. Now, Arshak II fought very brutal wars with the Sassanid Empire, and militarily, he was able to go toe-to-toe with them, right? He even fought the Romans as well, so he switched sides several times. And militarily, he was quite successful every time when he had his forces backing him. Now, the issue here is that in terms of domestic politics, he sort of started creating these rifts that eventually brought about the demise of the kingdom, that his successors were unable to rectify. So Arshak II, one of his notable exploits was he created a new capital city called Arshakavan, and he actually freed all the prisoners, and he wanted them to populate the capital. This angered the nobility, who went against the king and destroyed that new city, and then the king went against them and defeated them. But this is, of course, just one of many events that occurred during his reign. There were several betrayals during his reign. Important generals, important nobles betrayed the kingdom and went over to the Persian side during the war. And there was extreme back and forths during this war of Arshak II against the Sassanids, against Shapur, if I'm not mistaken. And Arshak was able to hold his own for quite a number of years until he was actually captured along with the head of the Armenian army and captured during a diplomatic meeting, according to the texts. And he died in a tower. So during interesting king, he held his own militarily, but in terms of domestic policy, in terms of foreign policy, he sort of laid the foundations for the demise of the kingdom. So I have to give Arshak II a C. He held his own, but politically, religiously, domestically, in terms of foreign policy, not a very good king, okay, in my opinion. Next, we have another Artashes picture. He goes up in S2. Okay, so next we have Hetum II, king of Armenian Kilikia from, he was king from about 1289 to 1307, intermittently, because he would actually retire to become a monk about 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. And his reign was disastrous. His father, Levon II, had fought so hard to bring the kingdom back on firm footing after having been really slapped around by the Mongols near the end of his father Hetum I's reign. And Hetum II really squandered all of that, and he did so by, he was a full-blown Catholic. He wanted to become a Dominican monk, a Catholic monk, so he was a full-blown Catholic. He didn't want to be king. He didn't want to rule. And in the end, he didn't really know what he was doing. And he didn't want it. He didn't want to be king. He didn't want that responsibility. He wanted to go and be a monk in the monastery. However, according to the rules of succession, he was the king. And he led the kingdom to the beginning of the end, unfortunately. And his reign caused such division, such internal division, that it was really difficult for the king to even muster up a good amount of forces. When Levon II mustered troops to join the Mongols, and Hetum as well, they were able to muster thousands of troops, perhaps 15 to 20,000, large numbers of troops. But by Hetum II's reign, when we have Hetum II joining the Mongols on their early 14th century campaign against the Mamluks, which was actually a joint Mongol-Armenian victory in the beginning, but eventually the Mamluks were able to destroy the Mongol army again. Hetum was only able to bring 5,000 troops, right? So militarily, economically, the kingdom declined sharply. And in the middle of his reign, you have a devastating civil war. And this is all between the brothers. So Levon II had many children, and they were at each other's throats during the reign of Hetum II. Now, Hetum II abdicated in favor of his brother Toros I, king. And Toros was killed by the brothers Simpad and Constantine. Again, they were all brothers. And Hetum was blinded in the monastery. And, eventually Constantine felt bad about what had happened. So he went to the monastery, got Hetum out, and they plotted against Simpad and were able to kill him. Right? But then, he thought that he could betray Hetum again, so then he was killed. Really a devastating time at the end of near the end of the 13th century for the kingdom. So the brothers were at each other's throats. They all died miserably. There's a famous European historian who talks about how the sons of Levon II died miserably, all of them. And Hetum II, he did recover from his blindness, so that's interesting. But again, he abdicated again near the end of his life, and he abdicated in favor of his other brother Levon III. And Hetum and Levon, Levon had a guest Mongol general, and this Mongol general wanted to construct a mosque in Sis, the capital of Armenian Kilikia, and Levon III, being again very pro-Western, pro-Catholic, like Hetum II, being unable to really do this balancing act of diplomacy, outright refused, and the Mongol general killed Levon and Hetum as well, and they died miserably. And that, of course, left Oshin, who we ranked at B here, again, another son of Levon II, to sort of deal with that mess, and who sort of put the kingdom back on a more firm footing. But Hetum II, very, very bad rule. The kingdom was in a horrible state. Writers from the time talk about the kingdom being in a very depressing state. Lawlessness. Hetum II goes in D. If there was an F, he would go there along with Levon IV. Okay. So now we have Artavazd II. Artavazd II was the son of Tigran the Great. Tigran II. Perhaps the most famous king of Armenia. And Artavazd II was again a king of kings, just like his father. So like his father, Tigranes II, Artavazd II was called king of kings. And that's because even though Tigran II, or Tigran the Great, had lost a bunch of territory in Syria, Kilikia, and southwest, his treaty with the Romans provided that he was sort of the supreme king in the sort of South Caucasus region, so that's why he retained the title King of Kings, and his son also had that title, King of Kings. And Artavazd was an interesting king. He was very much a culturally important figure. He wrote many plays in Greek that we know about. Unfortunately, none of them have been preserved. However, that's a pretty significant achievement. And actually, there are some texts from Armavir, which was the capital of the Orontid dynasty, or the first capital of the Orontid dynasty, the Ervanduni dynasty, that ruled prior to the Artashesian dynasty. And there are actually a few epigraphic inscriptions in Greek that are located near the Armavir tell, as well as near the tell of where Argishti is located, an Urartian fortress. And in these inscriptions talk about the downfall of Yerevan IV, the last king of the Orontid dynasty, and they talk a little bit about him. And actually, some historians consider this to be from the Orontid period, some sort of a historical text. But some historians consider these inscriptions to be from actually Artavazd II, and some excerpts of a play of his, a tragedy about King Yerevan IV, King Orontes IV. So perhaps there is a little bit preserved there. And in case you are interested, I'll put a link in the description to a description of those inscriptions. Now, in terms of his military policy, foreign policy, domestic policy, we don't know much about his domestic policy. We know he did retain the title King of Kings, and then I believe later in his reign we have coins that do not have that title. So at some point he was no longer able to keep that. He did have conflicts with, the Parthians, with the Romans at different times. He tried to play both sides, as Armenian kings were wont to do, until the 5th century and after and beyond, to the present day, you can say. And Artavazd actually had some successes, so he did lead he did lead Romans like Mark Antony into traps, right? So he had some successes in weakening both the Parthians and the Romans. However, of course, eventually these policies didn't pan out for him because he was captured, kidnapped, and executed by Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt. So, kind of a... He did have a big cultural impact. Unfortunately, not much of that is left. He did sort of maintain his kingdom to a degree, but he was unsuccessful, and that's why he goes under sea. Politically, he was rather unsuccessful, and he did get captured and killed. So, he belongs with Arshak II, you could say. Okay. So next we have Ashot II. Ashot II was a king of the Bagratid dynasty of Armenia. He ruled in the early part of the 10th century. And his predecessor, Sambat I, the Confessor, had a very rough go of it militarily, right? So Sambat was defeated by the emirate of Azerbaijan, right, militarily, and he was forced to make a lot of concessions. Ashot Yergat kind of inherited this situation, right, this difficult situation. Armenia had just been militarily defeated, and he had to fend off attacks from a lot of people because this defeat, of course, caused internal instability, several internal rebellions, external forces tried to destroy the kingdom. And Ashot II actually got the epithet Yergat, which means iron. And that's because he was able to hold them all off. And he was able to cement alliances that he needed, that were necessary to maintain the kingdom. He was able to reverse the military situation and put the kingdom on a firm footing again. And without him, the kingdom would not have lasted over 100 years after his death. So, he is a A-tier king for me. He really maintained everything. It was a very tough situation. We can't underestimate how tough this situation was. So I'm going to put him under S. He didn't give up. He had that persistence. And, it's that same sort of persistence that Levon II had, but I would say Ashot was a little bit more successful in the end. Okay. So next we have Hetum the First, right? So don't confuse him with Hetum the Second, who I put as the worst. But we have Hetum the First, and he succeeded essentially Levon the First. So there were regents and other kings prior to him, especially someone who had married a European who had married Isabella, the daughter of King Levon the First, in the early 13th century, and that didn't work out. Those didn't work out, and then Hetum was able to come to power, and it was a grand marriage between the two rival houses. So Kilikia had two essentially rival Armenian houses. They were the Hetumids, the Hetumians, and the Roupenians, or the Roupenids. And Hetum, of course, married the Roupenid princess, Isabella or Zabel, and united the houses. And this was a huge event, so that's why you have this lovely coin, which has Hetum and Zabel holding hands, right? And Hetum was an extremely successful king for maybe 99% of his reign, right? Until the last couple years. So he reigned a long time. He reigned for most of the 13th century. So he reigned from, I believe, 1226 to 1266 or 1270, depends. And he was incredibly successful because he was very good at cementing alliances. He was very good militarily. He was very good in terms of making trade agreements. He was an extremely good diplomat and general, right? So early in his reign, right, he actually had issues with Seljuk attacks. He was able to fend them off, and he was actually able to sort of, he became a sort of vassal to the Seljuks, right? And so that would secure the western and northern frontiers of the kingdom. And because those western frontiers were hard to defend, there were fewer Armenians, right? It was farther from the capital at Sis, so it was difficult to defend. And then in the southern and eastern frontiers, he actually expanded the kingdom quite a bit. He was able to take a large part of northern Mesopotamia, all the way up to the fortress of Behesni, right? If I'm not mistaken, that's modern Besni. And he established Armenian hegemony political hegemony over a part of northern Mesopotamia, which had never been under the control of the Kilikian Armenian kingdom at all before, even during Levon's period of conquest. And and of course, he cemented that alliance with the Mongols. Now, the Mongols had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, of course, in Iran. And that was a huge empire, of course, and Hetum immediately understood that these Mongols were a force to be reckoned with. So he was the first monarch, Western monarch, or Christian monarch, to journey to Karakorum, the capital of the Mongol Empire. That's a long journey, right? You can imagine. And Hetum was actually successful in terms of cementing an Armenian-Mongol alliance against, mutual foes like the Seljuks and the Mamluks of Egypt. And this was an incredibly successful alliance because it essentially allowed the kingdom, despite a lot of internal instability, to last until 1375, as long as it did. Of course, it outlasted Mongol hegemony in the Middle East, but the Mongol alliance definitely did help politically and militarily. And he was able to cultivate alliances with Western powers, especially with the Italian powers, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and not Florence yet. That would come later. But Hetum was actually quite successful, to the point where, if I'm not mistaken, a Genoese Doge, a leader of Genoa, actually named one of his sons after Hetum. I'm not mistaken. And it was during his reign that Ayas really started to prosper as the primary port, as one of the most important ports in the Middle East for Asian to European trade, right? For those trade routes. Okay. Now, difficulties began in the middle of his reign. So you have, when the Seljuks collapsed, a bunch of different emirates sort of arose, and one of them was Karaman, the Karamanolu Emirate. And Karaman Bey himself was a famous military leader. He was very successful at taking a lot of land, right, in Central Asia Minor, and he launched a big invasion of the Armenian kingdom of Kilikia. And of course, Hetum had cemented that sort of agreement with the Seljuks and had made that frontier safe. So now all of a sudden there was a huge horde, essentially, under Karaman, an accomplished commander, attacking the kingdom. And that could have destroyed the kingdom. But Hetum, with stubborn military leadership, was able to really defeat Karaman and actually slew him in battle, killed Karaman Bey and pushed the Karaman hordes back, right? So he was able to keep Seleucia and a lot of those western regions under Armenian control, western Kilikia. So, and the manuscripts always talk about Hetum defeating the hordes, the king who was valiantly able to defeat invading hordes. So that was a huge success for Hetum. And of course, I talked about his conquests in the east. And of course, Hetum did have ambitions to be king of all the Armenians, so all the way back to Greater Armenia. He did have those ambitions. He did meet with Armenian lords in places like Artsakh and other regions in Greater Armenia to cement alliances. And of course, that allowed those princes to let the Mongols know that there was that Mongol-Armenian alliance, and they are related to Hetum, right? They are Armenian as well. So Hetum was quite successful on all those fronts. And he was able to keep the nobility and the church happy. He was able to cement those alliances with the Catholics without, converting to Catholicism. Just a really amazing king. Of course, in the last years of his reign, the Mamluks attacked in 1266 and really crushed Hetum's army. And his sons, one of his sons, Toros, was killed, and Levon, who became King Levon II, was captured. So that was a huge defeat, and the raids that occurred in Armenian Kilikia at that time were really devastating for the kingdom, and it was something that the kingdom never really recovered from fully economically. So Hetum, that's why he can't go under S, because it wasn't a perfect reign, right? But it was extremely good. So Hetum goes under A. Okay, so next we have Gagik the first. Now Gagik was king in the latter part of the 10th century, sort of that turn of the 11th century period of Bagratid Armenia. And Gagik, he was a very successful king. Remember, I talked about Ashot III being a successful king militarily, economically, architecturally. And however, his reign sort of laid the foundations for the divisions in the kingdom that would be its undoing. And Gagik I's reign, the same. So he was actually able to unite a whole bunch of territories that were under Armenian princes that weren't under his suzerainty. However, at the end of his reign, he was his sons who became king after him. They became king of different parts of Armenia, right? So Ani was one part, and Ashot IV became king of other parts, and there were other rebellions as well. So really, the divisions in the kingdom were becoming really apparent, and his sons were not able to solve these problems, and these problems began in his reign. But it's impossible to understate how successful he was, both militarily, economically, constructing several buildings at Ani, right? making Ani such an amazing city that, it was not fully destroyed during the Armenian genocide, and it has many impressive buildings still standing today. And that's thanks to, the reigns of Ashot III and Gagik I. So I can't put him as one of the poorer kings, but I can't put him as one of the greatest kings because of the political situation. He was unable to really solve the political instability, right? He was able to conquer new lands. He was able to solidify his rule, but rebellions occurred in his reign, like the kingdom of Lori was established during his reign. So I have to put him under B. Mixed bag. Next we have the most famous Armenian king in history, Tigran the Great, Tigran II. He was, of course, king from about 95 to 55 BC, the first century BC, and he was an incredibly successful king, right? So he was another king of the Artashesian dynasty, like his great-grandfather, Artashes I, and his son, Artavazd II. And he, of course, expanded Armenia and really took Armenia from being a regional power that Artashes had established and took it to the next level of imperial power for a while. And, those successes can't be understated. He took on the Parthian Empire and defeated them, conquered large tracts of land from them in northern Mesopotamia, in northern Iran, right, Media. He conquered Cappadocia. He conquered Cilicia. He conquered the Seleucid Empire. He conquered all the way down to Judea, right? He conquered pretty much all of Syria. So he was incredibly militarily successful. He conquered the other Armenian kingdom at Sopene. He cemented the alliance with Pontus, right, that made the sort of Pontus-Armenia tandem an extremely powerful force, the most powerful in the Middle East for a number of years. Of course, the Romans did end up invading. Lucullus, the general Lucullus, of course, attacked Pontus, defeated Mithridates. Mithridates fled to Tigran the Great, his son-in-law, and Tigran kept him, right? And Lucullus then invaded Armenia. And, here goes one of the biggest misunderstandings in history, because Lucullus was not successful, right? Everyone talks about these great battles at Tigranokerta, which was the capital that was constructed by Tigran the Great, right? And everyone talks about these battles that occurred, pitched battles. However, in which Tigran's army was defeated and he was very slow. It was a bulky army, not well commanded. And that's probably not the case. So Lucullus, when he returned to Rome after being recalled, because of course he was not successful, he talked about his successes, right? He talked really big about his successes. But, if he was so successful, then the army would not have mutinied. First and foremost. And it really wouldn't have been possible, probably, for Tigran to actually reoccupy all those territories in Syria and the south so quickly after Lucullus being recalled, because, it's just not that easy to occupy all that territory so quickly. It's quite unlikely that Lucullus was as successful as he claimed he was. Of course, after Lucullus left, and prior to Pompey returning, Tigran faced a great rebellion of his son, Tigran the Younger, supported by the Parthian royal army. And the Parthians actually besieged Artaxata, the capital of Greater Armenia, right? Tigranokerta was kind of in the center of Tigran's empire. Right, so it was not really the capital of Armenia proper. It was the imperial capital. And Artaxata, the royal capital of Artashes, was the one being besieged by the Parthians. And Tigran the Younger, who wanted to usurp the throne. And this was a huge revolt, right? And eventually, Tigran was able to win that battle. The Parthians retreated, and Tigran's son, Tigran the Younger, fled to another Roman general, Pompey the Great, who had arrived in Armenia as well, following Lucullus. And, at this point, Tigran's position had weakened politically, militarily, right? Because he had faced that huge revolt. Tigran the Younger had fled to Pompey, and Tigran was not interested in another fight with the Romans, right? So against Lucullus, he had utilized essentially Parthian tactics. Remember, Tigran had grown up as a hostage in the Parthian court, right? So he was very well versed in Parthian warfare. So that's essentially the kind of warfare he did against Lucullus and forced the Romans to retreat without giving pitched battle, right? It was very much a sort of Parthian, Scythian type warfare, and that's why Lucullus had to retreat. So Tigran was not interested in doing the same against Pompey, especially with the Parthian threat looming. So what he did was he concluded a treaty, right, with Pompey, where he gave up the Syrian territories that he had conquered, as well as Cilicia and Cappadocia, and he was recognized as King of Kings in the sort of South Caucasus region, right? And he was a sort of ally of the Romans, according to this treaty. And this is a very misunderstood treaty. There's going to be more literature on this in the near future. But Tigran was very successful. He was able to preserve his kingdom between two huge expanding empires. And he, even after giving up Syria, he was still recognized as King of Kings in the sort of South Caucasus region. So kingdoms of Albania, Iberia and Atropatene were kind of forced to recognize his suzerainty as King of Kings of the region. Okay, so that is quite a feat, right? All things considered, considering his difficult position. So Tigran, very successful king. Should I give him an S? I don't think so. I think he's an A. Because despite all of his successes, he was not successful in all his endeavors. So I have to give him an A. Okay, so next we have Constantine Constantine III, king of Armenian Cilicia. Now he was of the house of Neghir, so sort of house of Lusignan related to the house of Hetumian. And he reigned in the middle of the 14th century, which was a disastrous period for the kingdom of Armenian Cilicia. So he succeeded Guy of Lusignan, who was crowned as King Constantine II from 1342 to 1344. And during Constantine III's reign, really, Cilicia and Armenia became a rump state. So he was unable to cultivate effective alliances with the West or the East. He was unable to conclude peace with the Mamluks. He was, he again angered the barons, angered the church, unable to unite the kingdom militarily. Now, we do have some evidence of some military successes. According to some texts, he was able to retake Ayas in 1347 briefly. However, this is disputed. He sort of stemmed the tide. He was able to sort of make things nice with the Knights Hospitaller for a while, but it was a very difficult reign. He actually was able to preserve Armenian control of places like Korikos and Tarsus for a while. So Armenia still had that lifeline of a major port at Korikos, but he was unable to save the kingdom, unable to reverse the tide. Now, if his successor had been more successful, Constantine IV, perhaps there could have been some reversals if they had some more stronger alliances with Cyprus, for example, and were able to utilize the military exploits of Peter the Great of Cyprus more effectively. But he was unable to do that. His successor, Constantine IV, was unable to do that. So I have to give him a D. He was a failure. Now we have, quite fittingly, the last king of Armenia to ever hold that title in any real way. This is Levon V. So Levon V reigned from 1374 to 1375, the last 2 years of the kingdom of Armenian Kilikia, the kingdom of Armenia, essentially. And essentially, Armenia had been reduced to the sort of Taurus Mountains and the city of Sis and Anazarbas. So actually, Levon was a Lusignan, so he was French, essentially. And when he arrived, he actually had designs to retake Tarsus, right, which had been lost in the reign of his predecessor, Constantine IV. And without Tarsus, which was perhaps the most important city in the Kilikian plain, really the kingdom was a rump state, right, without Tarsus. So he actually had designs to retake it. However, he was betrayed by some Armenian nobles in the region, and he was unable to do that, mount that counterattack. He did try to cement some alliances so that he could launch some counterattacks against the Mamluks, but the Mamluks were afraid of this, right? They were afraid of having another European monarch as king of Armenia. So the Mamluks launched their final invasion, a huge invasion of essentially the rump kingdom of Armenia. And Anazarbas, the citadel of Anazarbas, huge citadel, fell after a prolonged siege in 1374, after a few months. And then in 1375, Sis, after a long siege, also fell. Levon fought in the siege as well. I believe he had a crossbow. He was fighting with his crossbow. And, he fought to the end. He didn't give up even after he was captured and then released and taken to, if I'm not mistaken, Aragon. He continued to lobby for campaigns to the Levant so that he could be restored as the king of Kilikian Armenia. But these were all unsuccessful, and then he was buried in Père Lachaise cemetery in France. So, all in all, he tried, but he was unsuccessful. He inherited perhaps one of the worst situations you could have inherited of any of these kings. So I can't really blame him personally for this. He really tried. He really tried hard. I mean, even though the kingdom was extremely disunited, he did try to mount a counterattack at Tarsus. That, you have to give him credit for that. I mean, he had almost nothing, and he was planning counter invasions against the Mamluk Sultanate, a huge opponent. So, you have to admire that about him. But he was unable to unite the Armenian nobles behind him. The church was mad at him because, of course, he was a Catholic. I have to give him a C, though, for trying. A C for effort. So there you have it. This is my tier list, my ranking of Armenian monarchs from S rank to D rank. So let's go over it again. In S, we have Ashot I, the first Bagratid king of medieval Armenia. We have Levon I, Prince Levon II, King Levon I of Armenian Kilikia, restored the kingdom of Armenia in a foreign land. Really, really amazing work by him. We have Vramshapuh, who was the patron of the effort to create the Armenian alphabet. Really amazing king, a master of soft power. You have Artashes, who really took the kingdom of Armenia, established it as a regional power and not just a sort of tribal kingdom, local power, right? And Artashes again, because he deserves it twice. And then you have Ashot II, who inherited a horrible military political situation and preserved the kingdom. And without him, the Bagratid kingdom would have fallen quite quickly, probably. Then you have Roupen I, not really a king, but he put the foundations for Armenian political power in Kilikia, in a foreign land. And that's really something remarkable that he did in the late 11th century, which was, of course, a horrible time due to the Seljuk invasions. Then you have Levon II, king of Armenian Kilikia, really, again, inherited a horrible situation, but he fought and fought and fought to preserve the kingdom, and without his efforts, the kingdom probably would have fallen again. Then you have Hetum I, king of Armenian Kilikia in the middle of the 13th century, established the famous Armenian-Mongol alliance, conquered new lands, killed Karaman Bey, defeated the Karaman invasion. Really a successful king, except for that battle of Mari near the end of his reign, a defeat against the Mamluks. Then you have Tigran II, extremely successful king, established the Armenian Empire, became king of kings, and constructed the famous city Tigranokert, right? So, very successful king, but with some reverses near the end of his reign. Then you have Trdat III, mixed bag because he destroyed a lot of heritage, but he established an Armenian culture and Armenian politics that would last for years to come, and a strong military leader. Then you have Oshin, king of Armenian Kilikia, in the early 14th century, inherited a horrible situation from his brother, but expanded the kingdom, refortified the kingdom, rebuilt a lot of destroyed parts of the kingdom, especially at the city of Tarsus. Really an interesting figure that I wish we knew more about, but he was not able to unite the nobility and the church the way he should have. Then you have Ashot III, very successful king of the Bagratid medieval kingdom of Armenia in the 10th century, made Ani the capital, was a very successful king militarily, politically. However, it was during his reign that you have the establishment of these sub-kingdoms in the kingdom of Armenia, which became the downfall of the kingdom. So, have to put him in the middle. Basically the same thing for Gagik I, unable to reverse that tide of political division, but a very successful king. You can't deny that. Then you have King Pap, king of the Arshakuni dynasty of Armenia, the 4th century, late 4th century. And again, militarily, a mixed bag, right? He fought the Romans and the Persians, but politically, disastrous foreign policy and a disastrous internal policy. So, really, describing his reign in short, I could put him under D. And you know what? I might just do that. Okay, so we've got Levon I, again, not a king, a prince of Kilikian Armenia. He was a successful military leader. He expanded Armenian Kilikia's control all the way down to the coast of Kilikia, and he besieged Seleucia, but this, of course, encouraged the wrath of Byzantine Emperor John Comnenus, perhaps the most successful of the Byzantine emperors of the late Byzantine Empire, and had his kingdom destroyed, or had his realm destroyed, essentially, until his son, Toros II the Great, was able to return and reestablish Armenian Kilikia. So, successful, but I would say overambitious, and had a disastrous foreign policy. Not a disastrous one, but one that didn't work out for him. Then you have Arshak II, a very successful military leader, but really disastrous internal policy. His new capital, Arshakavan, was destroyed by his own nobles, and then he had to destroy his nobles, and then he just was not able to unite the kingdom of Armenia in a time when unity was necessary. But militarily, he was quite successful until his capture. So I have to put him under C, not D. Then you have Artavazd II, son of Tigran the Great, king of kings, very culturally successful king, wrote many famous plays in his time. None of them are preserved. Perhaps one of them I discussed video. He was able to sort of preserve that status quo, the kingdom of Armenia, between two large empires. But eventually his foreign policy backfired. He was kidnapped and killed by Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Then you have Levon V, the last king of Armenia, inherited really a horrible situation. He tried his best, but failed to hold what was left of the kingdom. Of course, there were still Armenian principalities around after the fall of Sis, but there was no united kingdom of Armenia after King Levon V was defeated. So I have to give him a C. He tried. Levon IV. He inherited a difficult situation, but he had a disastrous foreign policy, a disastrous internal policy, killed his own family, and he ended up being killed by his own people. So, disaster. Then you have Hetum II. He wanted to be a monk. He wanted to be a Catholic monk more than an Armenian king. I think that speaks for itself. You have Constantine III. He reigned for quite a while and was not able to solve any problems in the middle to late 14th centuries. So he gets a D. Then you have King Pap, who I talked about, and I just switched him to D. I personally don't like him very much. He gets a bad rep a little bit, but really, he was not able to solve any problems. He could have. I think he could have, but he was not able to do it. He was not politically adept enough to solve any of the kingdom's problems in the late 4th century AD. So there you have it. Here's my tier list of Armenian monarchs. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoy content about, Middle Eastern history, Armenian history, Sumerian history, consider liking this video, consider subscribing to this channel, and I will see you in the next one later.